Hello and welcome back to the Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 100 called A New Hero. Yes, 100 episodes, and I just wanted to say a big thank you to you for listening over the years. And there'll be plenty more episodes still to come until the Roman Empire finally turns into Byzantium, which by my reckoning was after the Arab conquests in the 7th century. So, in the last episode, we left the rebel general Phocas triumphant, having brutally murdered the Emperor Maurice's entire family, apart from his eldest son Theodosius, whose whereabouts remained unknown. He then murdered most of Maurice's senior generals. Phocas's coup succeeded because, as we discussed, Maurice was surprisingly unpopular, despite being, in my view, one of the most successful of all Roman emperors, and having concluded an advantageous peace with Persia and then repelled the Avars and Slavs from the Balkans, he'd underestimated the damage done to his personal popularity by his cost-cutting. For example, no sooner did Phocas seize the throne than he paid his troops a handsome donative, although where he got the money from is unknown. If Maurice had done the same, the coup would probably never have happened. The moral from this tale was never to lose sight of public opinion, no matter how powerful you might think you are. But Phocas had himself underestimated one thing, which was how the Persian Shah Khosroes II was offended by this brutal toppling of the man who'd secured the throne for him only 10 years previously. Khosroes was probably genuinely saddened by the way in which Phocas had executed the man for whom he almost certainly had affection. But Khosroes was also no sentimentalist. He wanted to put pressure on Maurice to concede some of the territorial gains he'd taken from Persia, and he was now free to do that with Phocas because of two developments that occurred in 601-2, just before Phocas's coup. The first was the end of a civil war in Persia. It wasn't a major civil war as the one with Bahram had been, but in 595 a general called Bistam had rebelled against Khosroes and was holding out in the Elburz mountains in northern Iran near the Caspian Sea. And it wasn't until 601 that Khosroes' Armenian general Sembat Bagratuni crushed this rebellion. The other main threat Khosroes faced was the continual warfare with the powerful Turkish Khaganate on his eastern borders. But again, in 601, this reduced because the Turks were drawn east to intervene in China. So, by 602, for the first time, Khosroes was able to turn his attention west to Rome. And he knew his critics wanted him to do this. In particular, they wanted him to recover some of the territory he'd ceded to Maurice 10 years previously in Armenia, which gave the Romans a territorial advantage that could be used to threaten the Persian heartland in Mesopotamia. And that wasn't all. Khosroes was also helped by a rebellion by one of Maurice's surviving generals, Narses, the Magister Militum per Oriens, who'd avoided the cull of his colleagues by being located at Antioch. He now left the city for Edessa, a powerfully fortified and garrisoned city, where he set up the flag of revolt against Phocas and called upon Khosroes, who wasn't far away on the Persian frontier, to join him. And Khosroes had yet another card up his sleeve. This was Theodosius, Maurice's eldest son, who, as I mentioned in the last episode, had gone missing, with differing reports of what had happened to him. Phocas claimed to have caught him and executed him, but since his head never appeared to join those on display in the hebdomon outside Constantinople's city gates, it was assumed this was a lie and he'd escaped. Now, Khosroes claimed Theodosius had joined him, and so he was supporting the rightful Roman ruler. Personally, I think Theodosius was a fake, since he never subsequently played a role in Roman politics. My guess is the true Theodosius died at some point soon after his father's execution, probably assassinated by one of Phocas's men. Now, let's get back to Constantinople. where Phocas was mopping up the blood of all the people he'd killed and celebrating his astonishing rise to power. Needless to say, Narses' rebellion was not what he wanted to hear. So he sent a general, Germanus, not to be confused with Theodosius's father-in-law Germanus, who was still resident in Constantinople, with an army to besiege Edessa. Narses remained in the city, confident its strong walls would resist until the Persians arrived, which they did. Phocas also sent an ambassador, Lilius, to Ctesiphon in the spring of 603 to plead for peace. But Chosroes wasn't having any of that. He flung the unfortunate envoy into the dungeons where, to the best of our knowledge, he remained for the rest of his life, and sent a message back to Phocas saying he had every intention to depose him and avenge his benefactor and friend Maurice. Thus began the last war of antiquity. Chosroes had most of the Persian army at his disposal and launched a two-pronged attack. The first was in Armenia, where a Persian army led by Zuan Vey advanced to meet a substantial Roman force which met them in the plain of Elivard and routed the Persians, killing Zuan Vey himself. Nevertheless, this was only a diversionary attack to prevent the Roman army in Armenia from heading south to counter Chosroes' main offensive, directed at helping Narses in Edessa. Chosroes met Germanus' army on the Euphrates to the south of Edessa and won a decisive victory in which Germanus was mortally wounded. Chosroes then advanced to Edessa and Narses opened the gates. A young man, claiming to be Maurice's son, Theodosius, was crowned with full ceremony. Although, as I mentioned, he was almost certainly a fake, this had a profound effect on those back in Constantinople, who were already tiring of Phocas's rule, and triggered a rebellion against him. Our sources aren't very detailed, and there may have been two separate attempts to overthrow him. One led by the surviving members of Maurice's family, plus some of the Greens who felt Phocas preferred the Blues. The attempted coup went badly wrong, and the Paschal Chronicle lists the hideous retribution carried out against the rebels. The leader of the Greens, called John, was burnt to death. Maurice's wife, Constantina, and her three surviving daughters, Anastasia, Theoctiste, and Cleopatra, were all beheaded. Germanus, Theodosius' father-in-law and the man who, you recall, had supported Phocas when he first rebelled, was also executed. Finally, Theodosius' own wife, who was the daughter of Germanus, was also killed. Then, either connected with this attempted coup or in a separate one, several senators tried unsuccessfully to overthrow Phocas, since we know that he beheaded 10 senators in a brutal way, including one named Elpidius, who apparently first had his tongue cut out, then his arms and legs cut off, whereupon he was paraded on a stretcher before having his eyes gouged out and then burnt. With this terrifying bloodbath, Phocas cowed the opposition and, in my view, established himself as one of the greatest tyrants in Roman history. Meanwhile, Chosroes' relentless offensive continued on the eastern front. In 603, the Persian army laid siege to Dara, which held out for 18 months but finally fell in 604. To prevent a complete collapse, Phocas paid an increased tribute to the Avars and transferred most of the Balkans' army to the east. He even secured a minor success when a Roman force recovered Edessa from the rebel general Narses, who fled to Hierapolis. The Persians neglected Edessa because they seemed to have been preoccupied with the siege of Dara. Indeed, Phocas sent envoys to Narses, who persuaded him to give himself up, and he travelled to Constantinople, where he expected to be pardoned, apparently. But we know what Phocas was like, and the moment he got hold of Narses, he had him burnt alive. Back to the Persian front, where Chosroes paused his offensive in Mesopotamia and switched his focus to Armenia, There was heavy fighting in 606 with the Romans defending the mountain passes well, but the Persians pushed them back and broke through onto the eastern edge of the Anatolian plateau. There, the Roman field army in Armenia was heavily defeated in early 607. This opened the door to the Persian advance on Theodosiopolis, the Dara of the northern section of the Eastern Front, a key military fortress and essential to holding the line against the Persian advance. Initially, the Roman defenders put up a stout resistance and inflicted considerable losses on the attacking Persians, but the Persian general Astat resorted to a cunning trick. He sent a message to the Roman garrison offering them a visit by the pretender to the throne, Maurice's son Theodosius, who was still being paraded as the legitimate heir to the throne. The garrison met him and believed he was authentic. They opened the gates to the pretender. What happened to them after that has not been recorded, but the Persians occupied the fortress and prepared for a further advance west. With both Theodosiopolis and Dara in his control, Khosroes had established a dominant position on the Eastern Front and was ready to make a further push into the Roman heartland. But in 608, news arrived of an event that would now change the entire course of the war. Roman North Africa had revolted against Phocas, and a Roman general was sailing to Egypt to seize the province. His name was Heraclius. The Frankish chronicler Fredegarius described Heraclius as, quote, handsome, tall, braver than others, and a fighter. The 10th century Byzantine writer Leo Grammaticus described him as, quote, broad-chested with beautiful blue eyes and golden hair. Such a legend has built up about Heraclius, it's difficult to separate fact from fiction, but he would dominate the history of Western Eurasia for the next 30 years, and the significance of his life and reign can only be compared with that of a contemporary whose effect on world history would be even greater, the Prophet Muhammad. Heraclius was probably born in around 575, where we don't know. His father was also named Heraclius and his mother Epiphania. Both belonged to the elite of Roman high society. Historians can't agree on his parents' origins, but most believe his father was probably Armenian and his mother Cappadocian. As mentioned in episode 98, his father was a prominent general serving under the Emperor Maurice and had seen action on the Eastern Front. We know that in 595 his father was Magister Militum per Armenium, and that by around 600 he was the Exarch of Carthage. By 608, Heraclius the Younger would have been around 33 years old and had spent the last 8 years or so in North Africa. In Fredegarius's eulogistic description, he's described as an inspiring young man, especially learned and intelligent as well as athletic and brave, whose pastime was to fight lions in the Roman arenas that still served to provide public entertainment. Why did Heraclius and his father choose to rebel in 608? Most of our sources claim the primary motive was outrage at Phocas's unchristian behaviour. A more romantic story is told by John of Nikiu, who says Phocas had captured and imprisoned Heraclius's fiancée, a Cappadocian girl named Fabia. John of Nikiu tells us Phocas harboured sexual designs on the girl, and Heraclius was motivated to save his fiancée before it was too late. Holding family members and relatives hostage in this way as a guarantee of good behaviour was standard practice at this time, and as we'll shortly hear, this story seems to be true. But the most compelling reason of all was probably that by 608 the entire empire was on the brink of revolt against Phocas's pernicious rule. John of Nikiu says there was widespread rioting in the towns and cities of the Levant against Phocas, with some of his governors being lynched. Indeed, Antioch seems to have declared its independence from the regime. Heraclius needed to strike now before the empire dissolved into chaos. With his world collapsing around him, Phocas's response was, as expected, a brutal one. He appointed a man renowned for his savagery named Bonosus to suppress the insurrections in the Levant and punish the offenders. He's said to have amassed instruments of torture as well as wild beasts to use on his victims, and then marched to Antioch, where he put the revolt down and strung up its perpetrators. Meanwhile, Heraclius was planning a double-pronged strike against Phocas. First, an army would march from North Africa to invade Egypt, and second, he would lead a fleet to Constantinople. Heraclius knew Egypt was seething with discontent against Phocas. Some of this was because of the religious division in the empire, with the Monophysites wanting to reassert their authority over the Chalcedonians, who'd gained the ascendancy since Justinian's reign. In 609, Heraclius sent his younger cousin Nicetas into Egypt to march on its capital, Alexandria, at the head of a small army of 3,000 regular Roman troops and a host of Berber auxiliaries. It was an easy victory. The city's inhabitants flung open the gates and welcomed the rebels in. They brought out the dead governor with his head impaled on a lance. They even executed the Chalcedonian patriarch. Meanwhile, Phocas's trusted hard man, Bonosus, was in Caesarea, torturing and executing the rebellious members of the town council when he heard of the rebellion in Alexandria. He marched down to the Nile Delta and met Nicetas' troops east of Alexandria. Bonosus' soldiers were probably imperial guards and routed the less experienced African Roman army. He advanced on Alexandria, stopping to mete out retribution along the way by executing the bishop of Nicaea, who had sided with Heraclius, and other rebel sympathizers. Nicetas retreated to behind the walls of Alexandria. It looked as if the rebellion would be crushed. Meanwhile, Heraclius' fleet had reached Cyprus and was preparing to sail to Constantinople to confront Phocas directly, but he was counting on a successful rebellion in Egypt as a prelude to delivering the coup de grace. Our chronicler John of Nicaea says it was Nicetas who saved the day by preparing massed, rapid-firing artillery along the walls of the city. These seem to have been of a rope-pulled trebuchet type and replaced the traditional Roman torsion artillery. They had a higher rate of fire and could shoot larger stone projectiles. The defenders' morale was also boosted when it became known that Nicetas had had an audience with a famous holy man who'd spent 30 years sitting on top of a nearby pillar. The holy man, who was said to be able to foretell the future, had descended from his pillar to predict the rebels would defeat Bonosus and that Phocas would be overthrown within a year. The next day, on the 23rd of November 609, Bonosus' men advanced up to the walls of Alexandria. The artillery barrage was launched to devastating effect. The large stones hurled by the new machines tore through the ranks of soldiers, who turned and fled. Nicetas then opened the gates and sallied out after them, slaughtering the retreating men. Bonosus didn't give up immediately. He tried to surprise the defenders with a naval attack, but he was finally forced to abandon his campaign and return to Palestine, where he found the towns had rebelled against him. He fled to Constantinople. The battle for Egypt was over. The rebels had won. Meanwhile, Heraclius had sailed his fleet from Cyprus to the Dardanelles Straits. Before reaching Constantinople itself, he stopped at the major ports along the way, such as Abydos and Heraclea. Everywhere he went, he was welcomed as a saviour. In desperation, Phocas prepared to defend Constantinople. He placed the Imperial Guard and the Blues and the Greens along the walls, just as his predecessor Maurice had done. It's worth noting that Phocas didn't recall the bulk of the regular Roman army from its defensive positions against the Persians, presumably because he felt a military collapse in the east would only worsen his situation. Heraclius made his first move, an attack on the harbour of Sophia, which was guarded by the Greens. He chose this because he knew the Greens had little love for Phocas, and he landed ashore a famous Green charioteer, Calliopas, who won them over. They turned to fight the troops loyal to Phocas, commanded by the infamous Bonosus, newly returned from the Levant. They overwhelmed Bonosus's thugs, and a regiment of the Imperial Guard called the Excubitors chose this moment to switch sides and proclaim their allegiance to Heraclius. Bonosus fled into the water looking for a boat, but an Excubitor caught and killed him. His body was dragged to the Forum Bovis in the centre of the city, the site of the famous so-called ox, a bovine-shaped furnace used to burn criminals alive, and his body went up in smoke. Meanwhile, the Excubitors and Greens raced to the monastery Nea Metanoia, or New Repentance, where Heraclius's fiancée Fabia was being held. They released her before Phocas could take his retribution. There was now an uprising against the hated Phocas in the city. He was seized near the imperial palace in the chapel of the Archangel Michael as he was planning his escape. We have many versions of what befell him next. All of them say he was first stripped of his imperial clothes, and according to one source, he was marched naked through the streets to the harbour where Heraclius had landed. There are several versions of what happened next. The most famous describes a laconic exchange between Phocas and Heraclius, in which Heraclius put his foot on Phocas's neck and exclaimed, "Is this how to rule, you wretch?" To which Phocas is said to have replied pithily, "Will you do any better?" All our sources say that the tyrant was then dismembered in front of Heraclius. Some say his genitalia were the first to be severed, not only for threatening to violate Heraclius's fiancée, but also because he'd raped a noble woman in the city. Next, his right arm was severed from the shoulder, and his right hand was impaled on a sword. Then he was beheaded. His body was dragged to the Ox, together with his inner circle of supporters, most of whom were still alive, including his chief minister Leontius, other administrators, and also the official starter of the chariot races in the Hippodrome, who the Greens accused of giving an unfair advantage in the races to the hated Blues, many of whom had supported Phocas and were now in flight. We can see that the popular obsession with chariot racing had not declined in the slightest. They were all burned alive or beheaded. The next day, on the 5th of October 610, Heraclius was crowned emperor by the patriarchs Sergius and Hagia Sophia. Immediately afterwards, he performed the marriage ceremony of Fabia to Heraclius. She changed her name to the more illustrious Eudocia and was crowned empress. They made a handsome couple, he the tall, strong soldier, and she his pretty young wife. The next day, the inhabitants of the city celebrated with chariot racing and the burning of images of the tyrant Phocas. But, as the anonymous author of the Paschal Chronicle wryly noted, it was those same foolish people who only 8 years previously had welcomed Phocas by donning white robes and lighting candles in his honour. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. The next episode will be in 2 weeks' time on the 7th of December, and we'll continue with the story of Heraclius and the last war of antiquity. And if you like the podcast, please do leave a review and join my mailing list on my website, nickholmesauthor.com. Link in the show notes, where you'll find maps, blogs, and a free ebook. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.